Welcome to the Jukebox Podcast from WP Tavern. My name is Nathan Wrigley. Jukebox is a podcast which is dedicated to all things WordPress, the people, the events, the plugins, the blocks, the themes, and in this case, how speculative loading is speeding up your WordPress website. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you can do that by searching for WP Tavern in your podcast player of choice, or by going to wptavern.com/feed/podcast, and you can copy that URL into most podcast players. If you have a topic that you'd like us to feature on the podcast, I'm keen to hear from you and hopefully get you or your idea featured on the show. Head to wptavern.com/contact/jukebox and use the form there. So on the podcast today, we have Felix Arntz. Felix is a senior software engineer at Google and a WordPress core contributor from Germany, currently residing in San Francisco, California. He helped establish the WordPress core performance team and has been heavily contributing to its efforts. He has been using WordPress for a decade and contributing back to the project since 2015. More recently, he has stepped into the role of the inaugural performance lead for the WordPress 6.2 release and subsequently of the 6.3 and 6.8 releases. In the latter release, he spearheaded development and launch of the new speculative loading feature, which is the focus of the podcast today. Speculative loading is one of the most important and yet almost invisible performance enhancements of recent times. If you're on WordPress 6.8, this new feature is already active on your site, working quietly in the background to make page navigation faster. But you might never know from the WordPress UI. There's no menu, no toggle, and no obvious indicator to show it's there. Felix explains exactly what speculative loading is and why it feels almost like browser magic. The ability for WordPress, using the browser's new Speculation Rules API, to load the next page just as the user is about to visit it. It's a clever use of browser signals like mouse clicks and hovers to anticipate navigation, shaving off precious milliseconds, sometimes even providing what feels like an instant page load. Felix clarifies the difference between conservative and more aggressive approaches to speculative loading and why the WordPress core team opted for the safest, least wasteful option by default, while still giving developers or advanced users the hooks and tools to customize or even disable it as needed. Felix discusses the origins of the feature as a plugin, the testing and data collection undertaking with tens of thousands of sites, and how this real-world data gave the team confidence to ship speculative loading to all WordPress users. We talk about what those performance wins mean at scale, how a 2% improvement on 43% of the internet translates into saving users untold hours of waiting collectively. We also get into the weeds on measurement and methodology, how the team uses data from the Chrome User Experience Report and HTTP Archive to track web performance, prioritize features, and validate real-world impact. Felix offers insights into how these global, anonymized datasets allow the performance team to make truly data-driven decisions. Beyond the tech, Felix addresses practical considerations, such as how to opt out or fine-tune speculative loading if you have specific needs, how environmental concerns are balanced by default configurations, and how plugins or agencies might build on this foundation in the future. If you've ever wondered how large-scale browser-level improvements make their way into WordPress core, or simply want to know if there's a way to make your own WordPress site that much faster, this episode is for you. If you're interested in finding out more, you can find all of the links in the show notes by heading to wptavern.com/podcast. where you'll find all the other episodes as well. And so, without further delay, I bring you Felix Arntz. I am joined on the podcast by Felix Arntz. Hello, Felix.
Hey, happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you joining us. Felix is joining us all the way from California. I'm in the UK, so there's a big time gap, and I appreciate you getting up early and talking to me. That's fantastic. Felix is going to be talking to us today about something which is now in WordPress, and you may not even know that it's in there because there's nothing to see here. But the endeavor of what Felix has built is to make all WordPress websites basically immediately better. more performant so that the end users of your websites will be able to access your content more quickly. It is something that's really fascinating. But before we begin digging into all that, I know it's a dreadfully banal question, Felix, but would you just tell us who you are so that people understand your credentials in the WordPress space?
Sure, thank you. I have been contributing to WordPress now for 10 years. So I started as a freelancer building websites using WordPress and eventually got into contributing to WordPress core after I went to my first WordCamp, which was a great way to get started. Yeah, ever since then, I've been contributing to WordPress core and eventually became a core committer. And now for over 6 years, I've been working at Google, the team where we focus on CMS projects for the most part. So I've been, especially in the last good 3 years or so, I've been sponsored by Google to contribute to WordPress with a specific focus on improving performance. So our team essentially co-founded the WordPress performance team, which is an official part of the WordPress.org project. And ever since that was founded in late 2021, we've been contributing to that effort. And the speculative loading feature is a big part of that.
That's what we're going to talk about today. Can I just rewind a little bit, though, and talk about Google for a minute? So are you employed by Google to commit to WordPress core? Do you spend 100% of your time working on WordPressy things, or do you have a proportion of your time which is devoted to more, and I'm doing air quotes, Google things?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I contribute 100% of my time, but a good chunk, probably 70, 80 or something. Our focus is, when it's not on WordPress, it's still on other somewhat related open source projects. So we have been contributing, we've been also working with other CMSs here and there.
Yeah, that's interesting because I know that Google have a big presence. If you go to the flagship WordPress events, WordCamp Asia, WordCamp US and so on, then Google very often have a huge advertising booth. They're a global partner, if you like. But drawing the line between Google and open source CMS is a little bit hard to do. It's almost like a philanthropic thing because I guess their job is to just try and make the internet better. And part of it, if they can make 43% of the internet better by seconding somebody like you to commit to the project, that's just good for everybody. So yeah, bravo to Google. I appreciate the fact that they're sponsoring you and helping the project in that way. Also, bravo to you and the team, the performance team. It is just a relentless good news story coming out of the performance team. So I don't know, when did you say 2019 it was founded?
Late 2021, but things really kicked off like mid 2022, I feel.
Yeah, and I am habitual about the WordPress news, and it just never stops. The performance team do something profound, help everybody out. It just ships into core. Most people don't even know that things have happened because, they're not in the baseball in the same way that you and I probably are. A profound thanks. Maybe there was just this massive backlog of things that needed to be tackled, maybe not, but it did seem that the minute the doors opened to the performance team, lots of dominoes fell really quickly. So thank you on behalf of me and everybody who uses WordPress for the work that I don't know whether you feel that you get the credit that's due to you, but I'm giving you some credit now. So thank you.
I appreciate it. That's definitely great to hear.
I'm pleased, that there's people as capable as you who are doing this kind of work and that you're willing to do it in the background. And a big piece of that is what we're going to talk about today. Landed in WordPress 6.8, but has a history prior to that as a plugin. It's called speculative loading. It sounds impressive, but it also, I guess it is impressive, and it's a bit like voodoo. It's kind of doing things that you wouldn't imagine were possible. Do you want to just tell us what it is? What is speculative loading?
So essentially, speculative loading, the idea is that when you navigate to a new URL, when you are browsing through a website and you go to a URL, the moment that you land on the URL, it starts loading. And we probably know that the performance aspect of that is very important to the user experience. So if a page takes, 3 seconds to load, that's not great. If it takes 8 seconds to load, it's probably horrible of a user experience. And so one of the performance team's goals is to make that time that it takes to load shorter. So what then speculative loading does is load the URL. The idea is that it loads the URL before you even get there.
Yeah, that's the bit that's voodoo. That's the bit that just sounds like you've basically hopped into Back to the Future and you've gone back in time a moment or something. It's very counterintuitive. So you are going to have to explain how on earth does it do that?
Right. Essentially, there are heuristics which can be relied upon to hopefully assume correctly that a URL will be visited. So when you are on a page on the website, there's, of course, links to other pages on the website. So if you hover over the link with your mouse, if you're on a computer, for instance, and you hover over the link with your mouse, maybe you'll click it. That's like one level of signal. It's not the strongest signal. But then an even stronger signal is when you actually click the link. When you click a link, you want to go to that URL. I think that's a fair assumption in like 99+% of cases. So when you click on the link, that's technically still before you're at the other URL though. We're talking about milliseconds. You probably think when you click, you're already on the other URL, but that's not the reality. There is like maybe, I don't know, 200, 300, 500, however long it takes. There are some milliseconds in between the time you actually click and that the other URL opens. So by loading, for instance, by loading a URL, when you click on the link, you still gain those, whatever, maybe 500 milliseconds. I'm just going to make that up now and reduce the actual load time by that.
Let me just prise that apart. So we're now going to talk about a tiny fraction of time. For the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about literal milliseconds. So let me imagine that I'm on my computer, desktop computer, let's start there. I'm on a web page and there's a bunch of links, buttons, what have you. I'm holding my mouse. My mouse approaches the button and it begins to slow down, because at some point we have to rest on the button. So there's this deceleration of the mouse and the cursor and it eventually lands there. And then I click it. Now, my intuition is that the click event is the moment. That's when everything begins, if you know what I mean. But are you saying that you can go back in time prior to me actually hitting the button with my finger? Is it the mere fact that, okay, the mouse has come to a standstill, you haven't engaged the finger yet, maybe the finger is literally on the way down in the real world, in this slow motion universe we're imagining? Is that kind of it? It's taking heuristics about where is the mouse now, how is it decelerating, or is it literally he clicked? Because if it's the click bit, then I don't understand what's different to how it usually was, because it felt like the click was always the moment.
There are different ways to configure speculative loading. And one way, and that's the way that WordPress core does now, is to only speculatively load on the click. You say now that that feels like it's always been like that, but it's not quite always been like that because of what I try to mention with, there's still like 500, maybe 300, whatever little milliseconds time between the click and the actual URL loading. So when you hit the other URL, then it starts fetching the HTML document and all the CSS and JavaScript and so on. By doing that already on the click, on the link, on the previous page that you're on, you still gain those, I'm going to say, valuable milliseconds. And we're probably talking about, at the very least, 100 milliseconds, maybe a few hundred milliseconds.
It doesn't sound like a lot, but you've invented time out of nowhere. You've completely conjured up time that didn't, well, actually, you've removed time. You've gone in the opposite direction. But that time was needlessly spent before. Now that time has been saved. You also mentioned that the WordPress implementation, and we'll get into how you might be able to configure that in a moment, but the default WordPress installation, so this is in every WordPress website from 6.8 onwards, it is set to, and I'm going to use the word conservative, but it's set to a fairly dialed back approach to this speculation rules API. I'm curious, and we'll get into how you do it in WordPress, but just in terms of the speculation rules API, what are some of the more aggressive things that you could do if you wanted to? And is things like the mouse slowing down, is that potentially part of it? Those kind of things.
Right. So maybe let me take a step back first to clarify that there's a speculative loading feature that is in WordPress core. It's built on a browser API that is called Speculation Rules API. We can talk about maybe two things. There's like, well, how can you use the Speculation Rules API? There are different ways to configure it, and that's something that we could apply in WordPress. But then we could go beyond that, and I'm probably not the best person to speak about that, but we could also think, how can you actually, what could the Speculation Rules API possibly do that it isn't able to do today? So in terms of using the Speculation Rules API, it allows different configuration modes for what is called eagerness. And you actually said it right. It's called conservative, the mode that WordPress currently uses. And it just means, I think it is conservative in the sense that it is the safest measure if you want to make sure you only load URLs that the user actually goes to. But it's also the least performant of all the options. It's always a trade-off because unfortunately we cannot predict the future. So there's no real wizardry going on here. And because of that, there is always going to be a trade-off. You can use signals that are very reliable on the user visiting the other URL, like clicking on the link. There is a scenario where you click a link and then you pull your mouse away before you let go of your finger. We probably all have done this, but we probably do this like 1% of our clicks, if even that. But people do this occasionally, very occasionally. So that's the way where a click would not trigger the actual URL, the link to be, that wouldn't result in the user visiting the other URL. This would be the one example where conservative speculative loading would still load the other URL and the user wouldn't go to it. But I think that trade-off is very, very little because of how rarely that happens.
Right. So the posture of the performance team was to go conservative. So although it's not the most performant, it is the least likely to end up in, needlessly downloading content that is perhaps never going to be looked at. But again, just moving ourselves away from WordPress for a minute, the Speculation Rules API, if we were to go on the more eager side, what kind of things could be brought to bear? And again, not in the WordPress setup at the moment, but I know that you can modify those things. But what can the Rules API do if you go like full eager?
You're right. So you can also use the next after conservative is called moderate. That uses signals that are less explicit, like a hover. Again, I have to specify on desktop, it uses hovering because on the phone, you can't hover, like you don't have a mouse and it doesn't know where your finger is if you don't press the screen. So essentially moderate on desktop, it relies on the hover over a link to preload the URL that is behind that link. So that generally, yeah, of course, if you hover over a link and then you click it, there may be like easily a second between this, or there may even be 5 seconds in between those two actions, right? Sometimes you hover and click immediately. Other times you hover and you get back there and then you click. And in that case, the whole page can technically be already loaded. So that's the part where speculative loading, if you configure it more eagerly, you can get to situations where you get instant page load. You go to the other page and it's already completely loaded. For instance, there is also Core Web Vitals metric, largest contentful paint, which measures the load time speed. So you can get to an LCP of 0. Like literally, if you use it, for instance, with moderate eagerness, let's say your page normally takes 2 seconds to load completely. And you hover over a link and then you get back there like 3 seconds later, you click, it's already there and your LCP is literally 0 because you didn't need to wait at all. That's the performance power that it has. But of course, it does also come with a trade-off to consider, like, how do you configure this in a way that it's the least wasteful, and wasteful in the sense of loading URLs that the user does not go to, ends up not navigating to. But you have to basically weigh off what is the performance gain? How do users typically use your website? There's a lot of individual configurations that websites may want to do on their specific site. So going back to the conservative option that WordPress now uses is simply that we want to give the bare minimum feature and we want to make the feature available in general to WordPress sites. But because WordPress is so massive, you need to go with a literally conservative default.
Okay, so that's all really interesting, but it sounds like all of this is happening in the browser. So all of these events are being triggered by the browser. Again, forgive my ignorance. I'm presuming that Chromium, Chrome, Firefox, all of the other variants that there may be out there, I guess they're all shipping some variant of this inside the browser, because obviously it can't be WordPress that's doing this. If that's the case, is there kind of like a broad consortium of people who are working on this initiative, maybe other similar related performance initiatives, and trying to make them all browser compatible?
So there is the Speculation Rules API is currently, it's available in Chrome, Edge, and Opera, so in the Chromium-based browsers, but it's not available yet in Safari and Firefox. That means that people that use Safari or Firefox, they're basically just not going to get the benefit.
So it's like a progressive enhancement. There's no downside, it's just an upside.
Exactly. So because overall the browsers that support it are very widely used, plus the other browsers not having any negative effects of this feature being on a website, that's why we thought it was a good time to roll it out.
Okay, that's really interesting. It just suddenly, and completely unrelated to the conversation that we've had so far, it kind of makes me think that maybe in the future there'll be a hardware layer to this. You know, imagine if my mouse had built into it some pressure sensation or even proximity sensor where it could perceive that, you know, my finger is descending, and it could fire the signal from the mouse to say, yeah, he's about to click. Or even in a mobile phone, you know, you were mentioning earlier, we don't know where your finger is. Maybe at some point in the future, we will know where your finger is.
That would be really powerful. Yeah.
Be kind of interesting. Okay, you heard it here first, but it's not there yet. So what has been the way that this has been implemented? My understanding is that you launched this as a plugin. I think you got a fairly high user count. I think 30,000, 50,000 or something websites.
I think it's now at 50,000.
50,000. So tons of data coming back. And presumably that data gave you the confidence to, let's push this through. And I have a memory that, broadly speaking, you got fairly close to a 2% productivity gain. And obviously at 43% of the web, if we can do things 2% faster, it doesn't sound like a lot, 2%, but 2% of everything that WordPress gives up, that's a lot.
Performance is really like, people say sometimes things are numbers games, but performance is a tiny numbers game. Like, it's very hard to make performance wins sound very appealing. It's like, here's 2% win. We scratched off 80 milliseconds of this. And it's like, what is this even? Like,
but it literally is human years. It's probably decades of time when you think about the internet as a whole. If you think about it in that sense, it's really quite a lot of time.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that sometimes. I feel myself like announcing something where it's like, oh, here we scratched 80 milliseconds off. It sounds like nothing. It is quite something, but it sounds like so little that, I don't know, I feel self-conscious like saying such a tiny number as a great win. But yeah, again, like I think you exactly mentioned it. The scale of rolling out performance enhancements like this, it really makes the number matter. And also, people browse so many web pages a day. Like, even for an individual person, if you go on one website, you easily might visit 10 URLs or more, and that's just one website. So think about, again, I'm just continuing with that number. Like, if you had 80 milliseconds gain on all the web pages you visit in a day, I don't know, it might come out at some seconds, maybe a minute, who knows? And if you do that every single day, like, you gain time.
Yeah, I agree. It's difficult to parse, isn't it? The human brain doesn't kind of work at that microscopic level. That really tiny fraction of time is so difficult to become important. But there's this compound interest effect to it. You know, the more that it adds up, the more time you spend on the internet every day clicking things. And I suppose the curious thing here is nobody even knows that it's happened. You would presumably just think, gosh, that's a very quick website. You know, I'm having a fabulous experience here. Everything's loading amazingly. They must have an amazing server set up, or, you know, they've got everything configured perfectly. And all the while, it's the speculation rules API working in the background. But I think we've got it. You know, it's adding up to tons of time, probably years, maybe decades of time when you throw that across the whole footprint that WordPress have. However, most people who don't follow the WordPress news really, really carefully probably won't know about this. And there's nowhere to know about it, really, apart from WordPress journalism and the blog posts that go out from the performance team, because there's no way in the WordPress UI, there's no setting, there's no menu item to go to, there's no toggle, there's none of that. So that then leads me to ask, is there a way to modify this if you have a need for more eager, or you just wish to, I don't know, you've got a desire to turn it off for some reason? Can it be modified with code, with hooks, with whatever?
Yeah, certainly. Quick context on the reason that there's no UI in WordPress core to control it is that it's considered a very technical feature. And the philosophy of WordPress core says decisions, not options. That's one of the core philosophies. So try to use defaults that work for the majority, and most people won't have to change. And then especially when it comes to very technical things, you don't want to bother an end user that just wants to create their website with, here, you need to learn now about this complex speculation rules API. Like, we already talk about this for like 30 minutes now, and there's probably so much more to uncover. So you can imagine that certain site owners don't want to deal with that. So that's why there's no UI in WordPress core, but it can be modified through hooks, like you're saying. There are several filters and actions to modify the behavior programmatically. And in addition, the speculative loading plugin that existed prior to the core launch, that still exists. And it's now, when you install it on top of 6.8, it still serves a purpose. While it doesn't ship the whole API anymore, because that's now part of WordPress core, it still includes a UI where you can configure it via UI in different ways. And it also changes the default behavior of WordPress for the speculative loading feature. And that's essentially because when we started the plugin, we went with a more aggressive default because we want to know. A plugin only launches at first at small scale. It's meant to, especially in the case of a feature plugin, it's meant to inform us about how well it's working, are there potential issues, and so on. So we went with a more performant configuration out of the box with the speculative loading plugin. So If you use the plugin, it will use the moderate eagerness that I mentioned before. And then in addition, it uses, and we haven't covered that at all yet, so it pre-renders the URL. So I can explain that briefly. The WordPress core implementation, the Speculation Rules API, allows you two alternative modes for speculatively loading a URL. Either you can prefetch the URL or you can pre-render the URL. Prefetching means you essentially just you get the HTML content already, but then you don't do anything else. Like it doesn't load any JavaScript or it doesn't load any CSS or images. It still waits with all of that until you go to the other page. With pre-render, it does everything, like literally everything. It loads the HTML, it loads also all the JavaScript, CSS images and whatever else is on your page. And it even renders this in the browser. Like it basically does everything as if you were already on the page in the browser. Just think about it as if you had the page open in another tab and you couldn't see it.
Yeah, you've just like pulled back a curtain suddenly and there it is. It was always there, you just couldn't see it suddenly.
And the pre-rendering is the thing that can get you to those immediate page loads, because when you use prefetching, it only loads the HTML. So then when you get to the page, it will be faster, but you still have to load all the other things and render it. But pre-render is where if you have pre-render and eagerness of moderate, and then we go back to our previous example, you hover over a link, go back there 2 seconds, 3 seconds later, then you might get this immediate page load with LCP 0.
Okay, that's really interesting. So you've kind of got two options. The first option is just accept WordPress core. That's how it is. And then maybe three options. The second option then might be you can modify things with hooks and what have you. And I'm going to link to the articles that Felix wrote in the blog post that goes with this. So go to wptavern.com and search for the episode and you'll be able to find all the bits. It's more easy for me to say that than it is to read out the blog titles and things. And then the other option, the third option, would be to download the plugin, which gives you a UI, but just caveat emptor, beware, it will then automatically make things moderate. It's going to be doing things in a slightly more aggressive way.
It brings you better performance, but it might also have more trade-offs on. It will load, certainly to some capacity, load URLs that may not be navigated to. If you install the plugin, just keep in mind that the UI that it provides also would allow you to go back to the WordPress core default. If you just want a UI and you install the plugin, just go into the UI of the plugin immediately, change it back to conservative prefetch, and you're back at what core would do as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Now, you mentioned LCP and things like that, and I think there's been an obsession for the last, let's go for 4 years, with speed and trying to get lighthouse scores to be impressive for your website. I'm curious, is there a way that Google, scraping the internet, can perceive any of this? In other words, if you do this, are you doing it simply to make your visitors happy because they're the people who are doing the clicking or what have you? Or is there some like core web vitals metric which can be improved by this? Because it feels like there couldn't be. Because I doubt that Googlebot has the capacity to kind of speculatively load anything, but maybe there's some flag in the, I don't know. I have no idea how that would work.
So that's a great question. I think you certainly, when you apply performance enhancements like this, the goal is that they benefit your website's end users. Google, of course, would love to know how well these features work, right? And also the people that work on the actual Speculation Rules API would love to see how the features are used in production, on production sites. And we as a performance team would also like to know that how it goes with WordPress specifically. So there is a public data set called Chrome User Experience Report, which is sourced from anonymous data from users that use Chrome and have opted into this anonymous data tracking. So there is essentially a data set that collects the performance data of people visiting websites. And that is made publicly available. You can literally, if you know how to use BigQuery, which is this kind of advanced version of MySQL where you can query gigantic amounts of data, you can query the Chrome User Experience Report dataset, and you could be checking, like, I don't know, as long as the sites that appear, it basically aggregates all the data by origin, so the domain. Any site that is relatively popular is in there. I don't know exactly what the threshold is, but something like maybe like at least 50 monthly users or something like that. So then your site will appear in there, and you could query this for your own site to see how your site is doing. And you could do this every single month, and you get like a chart how the performance of your site is doing over time. Of course, neither Google nor we as a performance team cares about one specific site. We're doing things like in our team, we were building things for WordPress, for the WordPress ecosystem, try to improve the performance of the ecosystem as a whole. So I have been working a lot in the past years and learning a lot about this stuff, how to query the Crux, that's a short version of it, Crux, the Crux report, to gain insights on how do you possibly measure the impact a certain feature has on these metrics. There's another data set called HTTP archive, which is the domains that are in this are also sourced from the Crux report. But what HTTP archive is, it basically scrapes all of these URLs every single month one time and gets all sorts of public information from these URLs, like which technologies it uses. Does it use WordPress? Does it use, I don't know, React or whatever? All these things. It also stores from this one momentary point, it also stores the actual HTML body, and it's a gigantic data set. And also that is public as well. You can look it up on httparchive.org and how to use it. So the goal of these efforts is to make these different performance data and to basically assess the health of the web ecosystem publicly available. And then also these, especially HTTP archive has a lot of charts on their own website based on their own data that essentially, makes it easily available without having to query BigQuery data. But when you actually can query BigQuery data, it becomes really powerful. So we can combine the data from HTTP archives to see which origins are using WordPress. So then we get like a scaled down version of the whole web that is just the WordPress sites. And then we can combine it with the Crux data that has the performance results for all origins, but scope it down to only the origins that use WordPress. And that way we can see, for instance, the median LCP for a given month across all WordPress sites is this, or the median INP and all the other metrics. More importantly, what we have been using as a more important metric, though, is what's called the passing rate. For every core Web Vitals metric, there is a threshold where it's under this threshold is good, above this threshold it's not good. So for LCP, for instance, that's 2.5 seconds. And passing rate is essentially the number of, in this example, it's the number of origins that have a median LCP that's better than 2.5 seconds, the percentage of origins that have a LCP that's better than 2.5 seconds. And that you can track over time to see how WordPress LCP is improving or decreasing over time. That's how we essentially monitor performance for WordPress at a high level. And then we've been doing all sorts of experiments to try to get feature-specific improvements. That's really the difficult part, because these data sets only gather data. The archive data set only gathers data once a month. The Crux data set gathers data. It has all the data, but only the performance data. So it does not know at what point did you activate a certain feature, deactivate another feature. That data doesn't exist. So we can only make assumptions. Like, for instance, even when you want to measure the difference, and like an easy example, and that's already complicated, is to measure the difference from one WordPress version to the next. HTTP archive has data whether a site is on, let's say, 6.8 or 6.7, but it's from one specific moment in time. And we generally broaden these moments in time to the whole month, because that's generally they do it once a month. If you see that a site is on 6.8, I think the HTTP archive runs, like the actual queries usually run somewhere between 20th and 25th of a month. So if you see that a site is 6.8, you don't know, is the site on 6.8 the entire month? Or did it just update to 6.8 a day before and most of the month data is actually the previous version? This is just unknowns that we have to deal with. And the data set being so huge, because WordPress is so popular, that helps a lot to sort of like make these unknowns maybe less impactful, because if you at scale see that 6.8 has a big improvement, we can't say that this value precisely is correct, but if that's a clear improvement, we can assume that there is an actual improvement to a certain degree. And doing that for feature specific level is even more complex. I don't think we have time to get into this too much right now, but I just want to say that this 1.9% value that is in the blog post is based on such an effort where I tried to look at all the sites that have speculation rules, and I looked at all the same sites before they activated speculation rules and get this median difference between all of them. And I don't even know how to explain it anymore because I don't remember, because it was so complicated.
I am so glad that you are able to explain it though. I mean, firstly, really interesting. All of that really interesting, because you just sort of peeled back a whole curtain that I didn't even know existed. So there's just this aggregated opted-in data coming out of the browser, dropping into this massive data set. I can only imagine what that is like to deal with. But it does mean that you've got anonymized data you can make reasonable guesses in the aggregate about what's happening. You can refine it to WordPress, you can refine it to 6.7, 6.8. Okay, and day by day, maybe it's not meaningful, but if you spread it over 1 month, 6 months, what have you, more and more trends start to pop out. So you can see over time, you've got this 1.9%, and it terribly complicated though it might be, I'm glad that you did that work for us. That's amazing. Okay, and I didn't know that whole thing was going on. And again, getting back to the point that you made at the beginning, the whole purpose of this is to make it better for your users. The purpose is not for the data that Google's gathering, but it's gathering it, and it's helpful because people like you can then use it and make reasonable assumptions about what the rest of us ought to be doing with our WordPress websites. But the key metric there is, does it perform better for your users? And of course, we know the answer to that.
Just want to quickly add, these two data sets have been important source for us as a performance team from the very beginning in terms of even prioritizing what we work on. There's ways to get a high level idea, like out of all the 50 things that we could do to improve performance, which have shown to be the most impactful on the web so far, outside of WordPress, or maybe even on the few WordPress sites that already use it through some other way. So it has helped a lot on the prioritization. I'm personally a big advocate for data-driven decision-making. And in many parts of the WordPress project, we are not able to do that because we don't have much data. But I'm really pleased that on the performance side, there is this big data set that can be used to see what is actually impactful.
Yeah, you can be really confident that your decisions are based upon fact, which is so nice. A lot of the WordPress project is, intuition and design and things like that. And it's hard to get agreement about that and hard to get things right for everybody. But in this case, that's slightly different.
For anybody that's interested in this to learn more, I did write a blog post on makewordpress.org/core at some point about it, how to assess performance with HTTP archive, something like that. That's something that you can probably look at. There's a whole collab. I worked out for a while on a collab to teach as a sort of like tutorial how to get started with this for anybody that's interested.
Okay, I've got a couple of pieces that I've got open over here, which are probably not the piece that you've just mentioned. So when I come back and edit this, I'll make sure that I get in touch with you and we find that and we'll put that into the show notes. So there'll be at least 3 things that you, dear listener, can go and check out. I'm just wondering if there are any situations, because we know what people are like, performance experts, they love to configure their servers, they love to put things at the edge, that all these clever things that are going on. Are there any scenarios where things like the speculative loading that can conflict or overlap or be something that you actually don't want to do because you've already got something in place that might be handling, I don't know, let's say, for example, you're in Team Cloudflare and you've jumped in on all the different things that they've got. Perhaps they do this already, I don't know. But I'm just wondering if there are any scenarios where, let's say I'm a hosting company or I'm just really into my performance. Are there any scenarios where I need to be mindful? Maybe I want to switch this off.
I don't think there's a lot on the hosting side, but there can be on the whatever client side technologies you use. So because the speculative loading happens in the browser, I don't think there's anything on the hosting side or server side that could do something similar. I think that wouldn't work. But there are other ways that some similar things like this have already been done outside of a browser specification, outside of a browser API. Like there are certain JavaScript frameworks, for instance, that have something like speculative loading. Like if you have a Next.js site, for instance, which I think is not very common to be used together with WordPress, but if you do have a Next.js site, for instance, it might load URLs speculatively too, but through its own mechanism, like a completely separate approach. I'm not sure about specific JavaScript libraries right now that do exactly this, but there are definitely things like it that some sites were already using before the browser speculation rules API came around.
Okay, so broadly speaking, if you're a typical WordPress user, you've got nothing to worry about. And you probably know that you've got something interesting and unusual going on with loading things in a different way, so you're probably okay. One of the things that I did want to know, I just wondered if there were certain, I don't know, let's say I've got a WordPress website. Maybe there are bits of that website that I don't wish to be speculatively loading. I'm not really sure what that might be. An example that I think came out of one of your blog posts was, you took the example of I presume it was WooCommerce, the end of the URL being cart or something like that, so /cart/ whatever. That's possible though. I presume, again, with hooks, you could say, okay, this predetermined set of URLs, we don't want to speculatively load anything. That kind of stuff can be done. The URL parameters can be configured into all this.
Yeah, exactly. So you can exclude certain URLs or URL patterns from being applied to the speculative loading. And you can also configure whether you want to exclude them entirely or whether you want to exclude them only from pre-rendering but not prefetching. So this is important to consider because a WordPress site, while probably now 95% of the sites with 6.8 use prefetch because that's the default, there are still sites that change it to pre-render. And then there are different implications for the site, for the URLs that are pre-rendered. And one of the considerations is that's actually another reason why we went with prefetch, because also prefetch, even though it's less performant than pre-render, is also a safer option at the scale that we roll this out to all WordPress sites. Because the only risk with prefetch occurs if there's a URL that modifies something just by visiting that URL, which is an anti-pattern. Like, you should not do this, but there are plugins that do this occasionally. For instance, if you have like a URL that's called empty cart, and just by visiting that URL, you empty your shopping cart. That means if you speculatively load the URL and you don't visit it, your cart is emptied. You don't want that. This is the only risk with prefetch. But for what it's worth, WordPress, the WordPress core implementation also includes some default exclusions already. One of them is that it won't speculatively load any URL with query parameters, like those question marks, something. And that's because most WordPress sites by far are using pretty permalinks. And on those sites, having a query parameters is extremely unusual. And if there is, it's usually from a plugin that does something specific. And so that's why we exclude those URLs, because the chance that, like, WordPress core doesn't have anything in the front end will change something when you visit a URL, but plugins might. And plugins would usually handle this through query parameters if they do. And that's why we exclude any query parameter URLs.
Yeah, I know that you will not have an answer to the next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But I'm just curious on your thoughts about it, because I know that anybody listening to this, is going to be a proportion of people thinking, wait, we want less bits traveling across the internet. And I'm thinking about the environmental impact of things now. You know, we don't want pre-fetching anything, because that's then potentially just wasted energy, just carbon being burnt for stuff which may or may not be looked at. And obviously the WordPress approach that you've taken is to try and minimize that. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts, you know, around that, and whether you could sort of calm people down about that, or whether or not it was that whole thing disregarded. Where does it fit into the thinking of all of this?
Yeah, like I said in the beginning, it is a trade-off that you have to make, but it also depends, like, which decision you take probably depends on how your site is being used. Like, what is the best configuration of speculative loading for your own site? If you go with a too eager configuration where tons of URLs are eagerly loaded and then they might never be visited, then this definitely has a negative impact, like you're saying. But obviously the ideal outcome is that the wasteful reloaded URLs are minimized, and at the end of the day, you, by speculatively loading, you improve the user experience. I can't really answer where you draw the line in that. That being said, the adverse effects of URLs being loaded that you don't navigate to with this conservative eagerness is so little. That's why we chose that value to be the default. And you can go for more performance solutions or configurations, but when you do so, please test how that works out. You can also, don't want to get too deep into this, but you can also, if you have some kind of analytics provider for your site, you can gather like performance data, or you can see which links users typically click on. And then you could configure speculation rules in a way that these links specifically may use like a more eager configuration, but the other ones don't. This is where people really get, I've not personally done this, but when I've heard from other people when they work with enterprise clients, they really go in and look at, oh, when somebody's at this URL, they usually click one of these 4 URLs, one of these 4 links, and then you can configure speculation rules to say these 4 links should have moderate eagerness, but all other ones only conservative, for instance.
I can see a whole third-party ecosystem of plugin developers kind of rubbing their hands together. You know, those that create performance plugins kind of leaning into exactly what you just said. Here's your entire WordPress website, and here's what we think, you know, in the same way that SEO plugins might give you a traffic light, here's a set of URLs which we think you're not serving in the way that is going to be beneficial to your users or what have you. So that's interesting as well.
The tough thing though is that it's usually, I think it's going to be a very heavily dependent on the individual site. That's where my hesitation is with that, is that like, I'm not sure how much a plugin, a generally applied plugin throughout the ecosystem could predict that. I think it's often depending on the layout of the site. What is even the content of the site, right? What do people mostly click on? I think that makes it challenging from a general plugin perspective. Like to me, that's mostly something that developers would do for their clients' websites, or agencies would do for a client's website, or at an individual level.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just the beginning, isn't it? It's dropped in fairly recently. No doubt the WordPress ecosystem will kind of figure out a posture on this. Maybe third-party plugins will come along. Maybe developers will produce more documentation about how to wrangle it, how to surmise whether or not your website is using the speculation rules API in a way which is helping you, I don't know, measuring the cost of your server infrastructure and what have you. But just the beginning. So there you go. Now, dear listener, you know a whole load of stuff about WordPress 6.8 that you didn't before, because probably it was completely invisible to you. So is there anything we missed, Felix? Is there any burning issue that you think we did not cover that and that was important?
No, I think we covered pretty much everything. I just wanted to add that the new data from the Crux report comes out, I think, actually it came out yesterday, I believe. So it comes out every second Tuesday of the month. So I'm about to look at that. I want to take a look at that definitely by the end of this week to see whether we can get any impact data now that speculative loading is out. Because so the way that this works is the Crux data is released for the month before. That's what happened, I think, yesterday. So now we should have data on April where WordPress 6.8 came out. So now we can see how much did this feature launching in 6.8 and 6.8 in general affect performance. Hopefully in a good way.
Okay, yeah. So this is actually for you quite a big moment. You're suddenly going to get this data dump, which is going to actually cover this 43% of the web. It will be on most of the sites. And you're suddenly going to see what the impact is. Do you know, if you write that up, I will find it. If it's out before I produce this post, then I will definitely link to that. And I'd be fascinated to see if we can calculate how many decades or weeks or months or years of time we have actually saved. That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for explaining it, helping to create it in the first place, and basically improving WordPress in a very, very demure way. You know, not shouting it from the rooftops, but doing a lot in the background to make everybody's experience of the web a whole lot better. Felix Arntz, thank you so much for chatting to me today.
Yeah, thank you.